Today, Washington Bureau Chief for BuzzFeed, John Stanton, host of MSNBC's Disrupt, Karen Finney, political editor and White House correspondent at the Huffington Post, Sam Stein, and New York Times senior editor, Sam Sifton, author of Thanksgiving, How to Cook It Well, a relevant tome for today's discussion. And joining us from Capitol Hill is NBC News' Casey Hunt. Casey, we saw McConnell and Reid on the floor. The fireworks have begun. How likely is it that we get rid of the filibuster today?
Highly likely, in fact, near certain at this point, at least for these nominations that we went through. Harry Reid is expected to have more than enough votes, more than the 51 votes that he'll need to make this rules change. There are a couple final holdouts in the Democratic caucus. Senator Carl Levin, who's been around a long time, doesn't think this is a great idea, and maybe Senator Mark Pryor. This is actually a switch from the last time we did this in July. They considered changing the rules then, but at that point, it would not have included judges. And part of the reason for that was that Reid didn't have the support in his caucus to make the change. So it's actually been a switch. You saw in particular Senator Dianne Feinstein from California and also Senator Patrick Leahy, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Both of them have decided that they're on board with changing the rules for judges. And part of the reason, at least in Feinstein's case, was there was a case regarding the contraceptive mandate inside the health care law. It requires companies to provide coverage for contraception. And a D.C. Circuit Court judge basically held off on some of that, let this company not pay to provide that for its employees. And that judge was forced through the Senate in 2005, the first time that the nuclear option was threatened. And that was actually when Republicans controlled the chamber. So that decision and the connection to what had happened before is part of what set Feinstein off and has led us to this moment.
Casey, I want to open this up to our folks in New York. Sam Stein, this is like the Senate Democrats' version of Albert Finney saying, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore, right? I mean, to put this in perspective in terms of use of the filibuster, I believe we have some handy charts here. Republicans have used, there's been nearly one filibuster per day for the past 3 years since the Senate was in session. Republicans have driven the filibuster arms race insofar the number of motions filed tended to ratchet up in years when the minority party is the Republican Party and level off when it is Democratic. And just for history buffs out there, Lyndon Johnson has faced one filibuster when he was majority leader. Harry Reid has faced more than 400. Wow. So something's got to give, right? What is your thought about the fact that we may be seeing it?
My thought is the font on your graphic was too small. I couldn't figure out what was going on.
You're getting old, my friend.
I need eyes.
For our young, invincible audience, people who love the Affordable Care Act, I'm sure they can read
direction.
it.
Exactly.
Exactly. The point you need to pay attention to is the color. See how it goes up? Yeah, it goes up. That's what you're paying attention to.
Clearly, so there's two things. One is that, and we should just dispense with this, both sides argued the opposite side, and it wasn't so long ago they did. The other thing that we should just note is that the use of the filibuster is growing, and it is unprecedented under this president. But I think the most important thing, at least for me, is that, and it's an under-discussed element, which is that there is a judicial vacancy crisis in this country. There are so many open seats on the judiciary that is actually slowing down the process of implementing laws, of making sure that regulations are proper, constitutional, etc. And so right now, there are 93 vacancies in the U.S. District Courts and U.S. Court of Appeals, 51 pending nominees. If you want to be president, and if you want to get something done, you have to have that third branch of government filled. And I think at this point in time, Casey's right. People realize that the judiciary is facing a crisis and that the only way to get through it, at least from the Democratic perspective, is to break through this rules impasse.
But, you know, Sam, I think the sort of underlying message here, the reason there's going to be such a fight over this is because the only place things get done anymore is actually in the court system. That's where legislation passes through. There are major EPA regulations that are set to take effect that would have to go through the D.C. Circuit Court. This is like the most active part of our government, which speaks to an imbalance of power. But for anything to get done, you got to have your people on the bench.
That's true, but you also see it's a rhetorical issue as well, because the D.C. Court of Appeals is the focus of a lot of this discussion. And yet that's, in the overall scheme of things, a relatively tiny number of judges. And we have this argument about whether the D.C. Court of Appeals is underworked or overworked, too many, not enough cases. But if you look at the federal judiciary as a whole, it is desperate for more judges. And that's got to be a key point here, that we not get bound up in simply the D.C. Court of Appeals.
Well, and also the Supreme Court piece is a big deal, John. I mean, the fact that they are trying to carve out the Supreme Court appointment, because that seems to be almost like a Democratic insurance plan. We know that one day, if the Republicans actually get their act together, they may take the White House, and a Republican president may be able to fill vacancies on the Supreme Court. And the thought of having a court stacked with more Thomases and Scalias is terrifying to Democrats.
But, you know, I think any Democrat that thinks that Republicans aren't going to use this procedure to force this onto Supreme Court nominees is kidding themselves.
Right. So you think that that's going to eventually be taken away?
Absolutely. I think as soon as Republicans come into power, particularly if there is one of the liberal justices retires or whatever is off the court, they're absolutely going to do that. There's no reason for them at that point not to. And they've done this, you know, look at the filibusters. Democrats really sort of pioneered this modern use of procedural filibusters against judicial nominees, and Republicans have taken it to its next logical step. And, you know, the idea that they're not going to then do that with changing the rules, I think, is short-sighted.
All right.
But can we take a step back? I mean, you've got, think about in the lower courts, I mean, the amount of work that is not getting done is astounding, because they've had to basically put all of the criminal cases ahead of civil cases. So you have people who have been waiting for years and years and years for justice, which also happens to very nicely fit into their frame of government is dysfunctional. And, you know, the court is the only place where things are getting done, but at the same time, they're reinforcing that. Exactly. And, you know, the other thing that we're seeing, though, is that given the amount of destructive legislation or destructive things that have been happening at the state level and in the courts across the country, the idea of some of these vacancies actually, I think, makes it, Supreme Court is where we always go, but we need to think about what it means exactly. What's down at the state level, having some of those vacancies filled could mean that some of these cases don't get to the Supreme Court. So, and we don't think about it that way.
On the Clarence Thomas, Antonin Scalia thing, what I found was ironic was Chuck Grassley was saying, well, you know, you better, you know, be careful what you wish for. We can get more Clarence Thomases, Antonin Scalias. Those people made it through confirmation. They actually were confirmed by Democrats. You know, they're not like fabrications of Chuck Grassley's mind. They actually were confirmed by several
Although they seem to be at some point fabrications of conservative minds.
I just thought that was...
You know, Casey, I wonder what the sort of dynamic on the Hill is here. Part of the sort of functionality of the Senate were these gentlemen's agreements that everybody was going to color with inside the lines. And this is being called the nuclear option because it is seen as a drastic measure. And I wonder if it erodes any sort of sense of goodwill or bipartisanship that may still be, any shreds of that still linger in the halls of Capitol Hill.
Well, this move by Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is not going to do anything to bring the temperature down here. I mean, this is just sort of turning it up and cranking it a little bit further. And the reality is that the number of senators who remember being on the other side of the coin, who either remember what it's like to be in the minority or remember what it's like to be in the majority and need to get your judges and nominations through, is dwindling. There are 55 senators here who have never known anything but the side that they're on. So for the minority, that means that they're digging in and they view their role as simply being the opposition, and they've never been in a position where they've had someone back home that they wanted to put on the federal bench and they really needed some help from the other guys to get him there. And for the majority, you know, a lot of these new senators especially don't know what it's like to have an opposing party who's nominating judges, especially judges, with the lifetime appointments that entails, that they opposed extremely for ideological reasons. And so they just simply don't know what it's like. And so that partisanship and calcification has really started to define how things work up here. And, you know, the body has really stalled. I mean, this debate has stalled a defense appropriations, or excuse me, authorization bill that has sailed through Congress every year for decades. So that's the kind of rancor that we're dealing with.
You know, Sam Stein, I asked you sort of the meta question here, which we started off the segment with Jonathan Chait poses, which is that, you know, this is a race to the bottom in some ways. I mean, the fact is, I understand absolutely why Senate Democrats feel like they need to do this. I think the filibuster has been abused in a way that is shameless and shameful. At the same time, when you have two parties that are just grabbing as much power as they possibly can, I mean, what are the implications for democracy?
Well, that's where I think, you know, people who are, you know, true to rules reform are more inspired by the other suggestions, such as the one that Jeff Merkley had, which says you need 40 people to show up to sustain a filibuster, for instance, or you have to have a talking filibuster. That actually encourages some sort of interaction within the chamber, makes people actually stand by their principles for obstruction. And this is not really the resolution that would produce. I mean, this resolution is going to produce a lot more acrimony than that would.
Right. Maybe it should be filibuster reform. Like, you can filibuster this if you have dinner with the person you're filibustering
and pick up the bill.
If you pay for their steak, you can filibuster their legislation.
Do what you're supposed to do when you filibuster.